Welcome, dear subscribers and curious listeners of my channel. Lord Voldemort often made strange, and at times outright foolish, decisions that led to his downfall. His followers, the Death Eaters, weren't much smarter. Sometimes they were outwitted by ordinary schoolchildren, but let's be fair, even he who must not be named and other villains had their moments of triumph when they were one step ahead of the heroes. In this compilation, I'll remind you of the times when darkness deceived the light, and did so with surprising elegance. Number 1, Yaxley grabs Hermione and everything goes off track. During the escape from the Ministry of Magic, Hermione initiates apparition for herself, Harry, and Ron. But at the last moment, Yaxley manages to grab her hand. This disrupts the spell and nearly costs Ron his life. Sure, Yaxley didn't perform a magical miracle, but his action derailed the Golden Trio's plans. Instead of a clean getaway, they got a wounded Ron, constant fear, a need to change hideouts, and long weeks of wandering the woods. Sometimes one small move changes everything, and this was one of those moments. Number 2, isolating Harry from the world. One of the most subtle and devastating tactics: information warfare. In Order of the Phoenix, the Ministry of Magic, whether intentionally or not, played right into Voldemort's hands. It portrayed Harry as a mentally unstable liar, claiming that he who must not be named had returned. The result? Harry withdraws from his friends, becomes an outcast even at his own school. And while society rejects the truth, Voldemort grows stronger in the shadows, without drawing attention. Number 3, Pettigrew, Master of Disguise. Peter Pettigrew's betrayal is one of the most devious episodes in the saga. He not only gave up the Potters to Voldemort, but also faked his own death, framing Sirius Black in the process. After that, he spent years living in the Weasley household in the form of a rat, feeding, listening, observing, and sending information to Voldemort. His treachery was one of the key reasons the Dark Lord was able to return. Number 4, Draco's Vanishing Cabinet. In Half-Blood Prince, it's Draco Malfoy who provides the Death Eaters with access to Hogwarts. He repairs the Vanishing Cabinet, creating a direct portal into the heart of the school. What's striking is that Dumbledore, usually so perceptive, never suspected how serious the threat was. Draco, in essence, outsmarted many adult wizards and pulled off the near impossible, an infiltration of the most protected wizarding school. Number 5, the False Vision, a trap at the Ministry. The connection between Voldemort and Harry allows the Dark Lord not only to peer into the boy's mind, but to lie. In Order of the Phoenix, he sends Harry a vision of Sirius in danger, and Harry, without hesitation, rushes to the Ministry. The trap ends in tragedy. Sirius truly does end up at the Ministry, only to die there. The plan was cruel, calculated, and sadly successful. Number 6, the Tournament and the Cup Trap. In the final of the Triwizard Tournament, the Portkey Cup transports Harry and Cedric straight to Voldemort. This wasn't just a trap. It was a perfectly orchestrated operation to lure Harry out from under Dumbledore's protection. Critics love to say the plan was too complex, but it worked. Voldemort returned, Harry witnessed it, and the world changed. This moment was a turning point for the entire story. Number 7, Bathilda Bagshot, who was no longer Bathilda. After Ron leaves his friends, Hermione and Harry go to Godric's Hollow and fall victim to a clever deception. Behind the face of magical historian Bathilda hides Nagini, Voldemort's loyal serpent. The situation nearly ends in catastrophe. Harry ends up face to face with the snake, who speaks to him in Parseltongue, and Hermione doesn't even suspect the danger. The trap almost works, and only thanks to her cool-headedness do they escape. Number 8, Umbridge and the Ban on Magic. Dolores Umbridge walked into Hogwarts with a smile that hid a dagger. She wore pink, decorated her office with kittens, and spoke in the sweetest of tones. But her arrival in Order of the Phoenix marked the beginning of something far more dangerous than brute force. She banned practical defense against the dark arts. "You will not be learning defensive spells in this class," she said coldly. "There is no need." But there was. Voldemort had returned, and Umbridge was stripping students of the tools they needed to survive. She didn't teach, she controlled. She forced students to read theory from dusty ministry-approved textbooks. When Harry protested, she punished him with blood-quill detentions. "I must not tell lies," he wrote over and over, his skin sliced open with every line. The school became silent, afraid. Teachers were monitored. Hagrid was attacked. Even Trelawney was nearly thrown out into the snow. It wasn't chaos, it was slow suffocation, all under the name of order. Students who once practiced spells behind locked doors now feared being overheard. Umbridge created an inquisitorial squad, led by Draco Malfoy, to spy, report, punish. She didn't need a wand to break them. Number 9, the death of Alastor Moody. The night they moved, Harry was supposed to be secret. 7 Potters, 7 identical decoys, each paired with a guard. They flew into the sky, split into groups, expecting confusion, to protect them. But the Death Eaters were already waiting. "They knew," Kingsley shouted later. "They knew the day and the hour." It was no coincidence. Someone had spoken. And in the chaos, Alastor Moody, Mad-Eye, was killed. Moody was no ordinary Auror. He was the toughest of them all. He survived 2 wars. He taught constant vigilance. But even he couldn't prepare for betrayal from within. A curse hit him mid-air. He fell from his broom. His body was never found, just gone. The man who had taught others how to stay alive had been taken down in seconds. It shook the Order to its core. The trap worked too well. It didn't just kill a leader, it planted seeds of fear. Who betrayed them? Mundungus Fletcher? Snape? Someone else? The questions spread fast. Trust began to break. Remus Lupin grew suspicious. So did Kingsley. The Death Eaters didn't have to fight. They let doubt do the damage. Voldemort smiled in the shadows. This was strategy, not brute force. Losing Moody was more than a death. It was psychological warfare. It told the Order, nowhere is safe, no plan is hidden, and your best aren't untouchable. Voldemort didn't need to win that night. He only needed to show that he was watching, and in one strike he shattered their illusion of control. Number 10, Gringotts and the Fake Sword. The Sword of Gryffindor was more than a relic. It was the key to destroying Horcruxes. Harry, Ron, and Hermione knew this. They believed they had found it, hidden in the vault of Bellatrix Lestrange inside Gringotts. It gleamed with power, but it was a fake. A perfect copy, forged under Voldemort's orders. The goblins knew, the Death Eaters knew, the trio didn't. While Harry carried the sword across forests and rivers, it had no magic. It couldn't destroy the locket. It was just metal. The real sword, the one that had absorbed basilisk venom, remained hidden. And Voldemort felt safe. His Horcruxes seemed untouchable. "The sword is in Bellatrix's vault," Hermione had cried. But the confidence was false. And every day they spent with the fake was a step deeper into danger. The deception almost worked. The trio risked their lives breaking into Gringotts, only to find themselves betrayed again by the goblin Griphook. He took the sword, the fake one, and fled. That betrayal, rooted in mistrust and greed, nearly broke their quest. They had no weapon, no direction, no time. Voldemort didn't need to chase them. His trap had already wasted their efforts. Only when a Patronus led Harry to the frozen lake and he pulled the real sword from the depths did the balance shift. But until that moment, Voldemort had the upper hand. His lie, his forged weapon, kept the heroes spinning in place. It was a victory built not on strength, but on misdirection. Number 11, the Marauder's Map, used against Harry. Draco Malfoy was under pressure. Voldemort had given him a task meant for men twice his age. Kill Albus Dumbledore. The walls of Hogwarts should have made it impossible, but Draco found a way. And he did it by outsmarting someone who watched the castle like a hawk, Harry Potter. Harry had the Marauder's Map. It showed every hallway, every hidden stairwell, every moving figure in the school. But not the room of requirement. That was Draco's genius. He realized it didn't appear on the map, and neither did anyone inside. "I'm not stupid," Draco later told Dumbledore. "I've been hiding in there for months." While Harry watched footprints and waited for signs, Draco was vanishing into a room that adapted to his mission. A room that let him repair the vanishing cabinet in total secrecy. Harry was sure something was wrong. He followed Malfoy, watched him, obsessed over his every move, but no matter what he tried, he couldn't catch him. Every time Draco disappeared, the trail went cold. The map, one of Harry's most trusted tools, was suddenly useless. Draco knew Harry too well. He predicted what Harry would do and stayed one step ahead. It wasn't brute force or dark magic that gave Draco the advantage. It was strategy, silence, patience, and knowing his enemy. While Harry looked for trouble in the open, Draco worked in the shadows. And when the Death Eaters finally stormed Hogwarts through the vanishing cabinet, it became clear. Draco's quiet game had worked. Number 12, Narcissa and the Lie About Harry's Death. In the heart of the Forbidden Forest, Voldemort stood over Harry Potter's lifeless body. The killing curse had been cast. Silence fell. Then Narcissa Malfoy stepped forward. She was chosen to check if the boy lived, not Bellatrix, not a Death Eater known for cruelty. Narcissa, a mother. She knelt beside Harry. His breath was shallow. He looked dead, but his eyes opened. And then came the question that changed everything. "Is Draco alive?" she whispered. Harry nodded. "Just once." That was enough. She stood, turned back to Voldemort, and said clearly, "He is dead." That lie, simple and clean, was not for Voldemort's sake. It was for her son. In that moment, Narcissa betrayed the Dark Lord, not out of loyalty to Harry, but out of love for Draco. She needed to get back to the castle. She needed to find her child. And the only way to do that was to end the war. This was no grand duel. No spell was cast. But Narcissa's deception was more powerful than magic. Voldemort believed her. He took the lie and built a victory on it. He paraded Harry's body back to the castle, boasting, "Harry Potter is dead!" he shouted. His army cheered. The defenders of Hogwarts dropped into despair. And yet the boy lived. The hope lived, hidden inside a mother's lie. Narcissa's act didn't come from a plan. It came from instinct, from blood. But it was brilliant. It bought time. It gave Harry the chance to rise again. Without her, the final battle might have never happened. She was no hero, no villain either. But for one quiet moment, Narcissa Malfoy outwitted everyone, even Voldemort himself. Number 13, Lucius Malfoy and Riddle's Diary. Lucius Malfoy smiled as he slipped the small black diary into Ginny Weasley's second-hand cauldron. He said nothing, made no threats, just a smooth gesture disguised by charm and arrogance during a chaotic moment inside Flourish and Blots. No one noticed. But that one act nearly destroyed Hogwarts. The diary was more than a cursed object. It was a piece of Voldemort's soul, a Horcrux, though Lucius didn't know it. He only knew it had power, and that was enough for him. He had a motive. Lucius hated Arthur Weasley, loathed his fascination with Muggles and his seat in the Ministry. The Weasleys were poor, but they had something Lucius despised more than poverty: principles. By planting the diary on Ginny, Lucius hoped to discredit Arthur. Let the chaos begin, and Arthur would be blamed for it. And if Dumbledore was forced to leave Hogwarts in the process, even better. "The Chamber of Secrets has been opened before," Lucius whispered once. He knew history, and he used it like a knife. The diary worked faster than he could have dreamed. It whispered to Ginny, possessed her, forced her hand to write threats, summon the basilisk and nearly kill students. Hogwarts descended into fear. Dumbledore was removed. Arthur was humiliated. For a time, Lucius had everything he wanted. He didn't need to cast a single spell, just one small push. The magic did the rest. "If I were you, Harry, I would be more polite," Lucius once sneered. But it was his politeness that made him dangerous. When the truth came out, Lucius was exposed, but not punished. The Ministry still feared his wealth, and the wizarding world still closed its eyes. But make no mistake, his plan worked. And if not for the unexpected power of Fawkes, the Sorting Hat, and the courage of a 12-year-old boy, Voldemort might have returned far sooner. Number 14, Slughorn and the Tampered Memory. Professor Slughorn was a charming man. He loved connections, influence, and well-brewed potions. But when Albus Dumbledore asked Harry to retrieve a memory from him, one involving a young Tom Riddle, Slughorn became suddenly evasive. Not only did he refuse to share it, he went a step further. He tampered with it. "You're making it sound like some sort of dark magic," Slughorn once told Harry. But that was exactly what it was. He edited the memory itself, erasing key lines, altering expressions, making himself look innocent in a moment that had been anything but. In the real memory, Tom Riddle had asked the unthinkable whether it was possible to split one's soul into more than one piece. "Wouldn't it be better," Riddle asked calmly, "if one were to live forever?" Slughorn had told him about Horcruxes, not the ritual, but enough to send Riddle on the path of darkness. The falsified memory cut all of this out. It left a polite conversation, a harmless question, a shrug from a professor too wise to give away anything dangerous. It was a lie. And because of it, Dumbledore and Harry were stuck, unable to move forward in the hunt for Horcruxes. Harry didn't get the truth right away. He tried coaxing Slughorn, he tried reason, but it wasn't until he used Felix Felicis, the liquid luck, that things shifted. Under the potion's influence, Harry didn't confront Slughorn. He charmed him. He didn't accuse, he empathized. And finally, guilt cracked the old man's pride. Slughorn handed over the memory with shaking hands and whispered, "I'm ashamed of what I did." The true memory was horrifying. It showed just how cunning Riddle had been, and how easily he had used the weakness of a respected professor to gain knowledge no student should ever have. Number 15, the Lestrange Vault and the Trap at the Bank. Of all the perilous moments in the journey to defeat Lord Voldemort, the break-in at Gringotts Bank remains one of the most audacious and chilling episodes. It was not merely a robbery, it was an act of rebellion against a system overrun with fear and dark alliances. The trio's decision to infiltrate the vault of Bellatrix Lestrange was not made lightly. They knew the risks. But what they didn't fully grasp was the depth of the trap that had been laid within those ancient stone walls, nor the ferocity with which the defenders would retaliate. The mission began with deception. Hermione Granger, armed with a strand of Bellatrix's hair and a dose of Polyjuice potion, took on the formidable form of the Death Eater herself. Ron Weasley was disguised as a foreign and anonymous wizard, while Harry Potter used the invisibility cloak and employed the Imperious Curse, a moral line he had hesitated to cross. But the stakes were too high, and hesitation would mean failure. It was an uncomfortable compromise. To fight darkness, they had to mimic it. Gringotts, ancient and proud, was no ordinary institution. Built by goblins and governed by rules older than many wizarding families, its chambers held more than gold. They were layered in enchantments, traps, and riddles of protection that few dared challenge. But the trio had no choice. They suspected, correctly, that another Horcrux was hidden within Bellatrix Lestrange's vault, concealed in the form of Helga Hufflepuff's cup. From the very beginning, things felt wrong. Traversing the underground tunnels, escorted by the imperious Goblin Travers and the reluctant Griphook, the air was tight with unease. The cart seemed to lurch with suspicion, and the enchantments guarding the way shimmered with a peculiar intensity, as though sensing something was amiss. The descent into the bowels of Gringotts was a journey into a trap woven not only by magic, but by paranoia and vengeance. Bellatrix Lestrange had never trusted easily, and after her hysterical reaction to the news that someone had attempted to enter her vault, seen earlier when Hermione borrowed her wand, she had returned to Gringotts in secret. In a frenzy of suspicion, she ordered new protections and made covert arrangements with certain goblins. These were not merely protective measures, they were snares meant to ensnare anyone who dared mimic her image or touch her treasures. The Lestrange name carried both wealth and terror, and Bellatrix knew how to use both. One of the most insidious protections was the Gemino curse. Upon entering the vault, the trio found themselves overwhelmed by the sight of treasures, goblets, armor, and gold. But touching any item triggered the curse. Every object began to duplicate endlessly. They were in a small vault rolling right, but within seconds it was swelling with burning hot metal, multiplying at an astonishing rate. The artifacts became an avalanche. Even as they spotted Hufflepuff's cup on a high shelf, the trio had to battle through the weight and heat of cursed treasure. The goblins too had their role in this trap. Griphook had warned them that goblins viewed ownership differently. To goblins, objects crafted by goblins always belonged to goblins regardless of payment. It is no coincidence that when the theft was discovered, the reaction was not mere bureaucratic protocol, but a violent uprising. The goblins' loyalty was not to wizard kind, and in this moment Bellatrix's manipulations ensured that their rage was directed precisely where she wanted it. As the trio scrambled through the vault, illusions began to falter. The polyjuice potion wore off. Hermione's disguise melted away, her features shifting before the eyes of the goblins. Ron's foreign accent cracked, and Harry's cloak couldn't hide the truth forever. The bank's wards were ancient, tied to blood and soul. They had only moments before the full force of Gringotts would turn against them. Rowling describes the moment with suffocating intensity. The walls echoed with the shrieks of goblins and the thunder of approaching boots. The goblins, once wary employees, became a wrathful tide. They poured into the cavern, brandishing wands and weapons driven by insult and enchantment. Their fury was not entirely their own. Bellatrix had made sure that the desecration of her vault would be seen as an assault on the goblins themselves. And then the dragon. Deep in the lower levels of Gringotts, guarding the most secret vaults, was a Ukrainian ironbelly. Blind, tortured, and brutalized over decades, this creature had become both a symbol and a weapon of the bank's impenetrability. Its presence was a last line of defense, until it became the trio's salvation. Griphook, fearful yet loyal to his people's chaos, vanished with the stolen sword of Gryffindor, leaving Harry, Ron, and Hermione to face their doom. It was Harry who made the choice. Looking at the chained, suffering beast, he understood that their only chance lay in liberation. He pointed his wand, cried, "Relatio," and struck the beast's chains. With a roar that shook the cavern, the dragon surged forward. The goblins screamed, the stone trembled, and the trio climbed onto its back. Not with grace, but with desperation. The flight from Gringotts was not a triumph, it was an escape. The dragon tore through the bank's upper levels, shattering walls and igniting centuries of silence. Wizards fled, goblins wailed, fire met stone in a cacophony of ancient fury. The trio clung to the beast's back, unsure if it would burn them, crush them, or carry them to freedom. But it flew. Out of the cavern, out of the bank, into the sunlight. They had stolen a Horcrux, they had breached Gringotts, but the cost was steep. This moment in the saga marked a turning point. Harry, once reluctant to deceive or hex, now wielded the imperious curse and incited destruction. Hermione, ever the voice of reason, participated in a high-stakes infiltration. Ron, often comic relief, showed resolve and quick thinking under fire. They were no longer children. Gringotts had become their crucible. Number 16. Voldemort's Resurrection Ritual. The graveyard lay silent beneath the watchful eye of the moon. In that cursed earth, a transformation took place, one of the darkest acts of sorcery the wizarding world had witnessed in centuries. Lord Voldemort, who had once been reduced to a wandering, bodiless shadow, returned to flesh and blood. This was not a miracle. It was a meticulously designed ritual, fueled by death, pain, loyalty, and a legacy of hatred. The ritual of Voldemort's rebirth was no random spell or improvised magic. It was the result of years of planning, hidden alliances, and the cold patience of a mind born for cruelty. It began in many ways long before that night in the little Hangleton graveyard. When Voldemort first fell, his soul, tethered to the living world by the Horcruxes he had so arrogantly created, did not depart. Instead it clung to the barest existence, a wraith too weak to possess a body for long, feeding on snakes and rats in the forests of Albania. But even then, his ambition never waned. He waited, watched, and dreamed. And when a follower came, Peter Pettigrew, long assumed dead by friend and foe alike, the first domino fell. Peter Pettigrew, or Wormtail as he was known among the Death Eaters, was an unlikely instrument of resurrection. A coward, a traitor, and a survivor, he owed his life to Voldemort and returned to him with the fervour of a desperate man seeking protection. He is at Hogwarts, that faithful servant, and it was through his efforts that the Dark Lord would rise again. The prophecy had begun to unfold. Voldemort took him in, not out of affection, but necessity. Pettigrew's loyalty, though born of fear, was sufficient to carry out the grim tasks ahead. The Dark Lord's plan required 3 ingredients, each chosen not just for magical function, but for symbolic power. First, bone of the father, unknowingly given. In the graveyard, Pettigrew tore a piece from the bones of Tom Riddle Sr., whose life had been ended by Voldemort himself decades earlier in a moment of poetic cruelty. His father had abandoned him, had rejected the witch who bore him, had denied the bloodline. Now his corpse served his son's return. Second, flesh of the servant, willingly sacrificed. This too was no accident. Pettigrew, trembling, moaning and afraid, still drew the blade across his own arm. His hand fell into the cauldron, an offering of servitude, a proof of submission. This act symbolized not just loyalty, but enslavement. Voldemort was building more than a body. He was constructing a symbol of his return, a being reborn through dominance over the weak. And finally, the keystone of the ritual, blood of the enemy forcibly taken. Harry Potter's blood, the lifeblood of the boy who had defied him, was the final ingredient. When Pettigrew cut into Harry's arm and collected the blood, the ritual took on its most daring dimension. Voldemort believed that by mingling Harry's blood with his own, he would neutralize the power of Lily Potter's sacrificial protection, the magic that had once made Harry untouchable. In his arrogance, Voldemort thought he had outwitted love itself. "Now, I can touch you. Now," he whispered, his new hand caressing the scarred skin of Harry's cheek. And he could. The protection Lily had left in Harry's veins no longer repelled him. But this was not because Voldemort had undone her magic. In truth, he had made it a part of himself. As Dumbledore later explained, he took your blood, believing it would strengthen him. He took into himself a tiny part of the enchantment your mother laid upon you when she died for you. Voldemort had miscalculated. He made Harry's survival inevitable, even as he claimed power over him. The graveyard was not chosen by accident. Little Hangleton was the site of Voldemort's paternal heritage, where his Muggle family had lived, where he had first tasted murder. The ground was thick with history and death, fertile soil for dark magic. The statue of the angel in the graveyard stood above the scene like a fallen witness. There, beneath the moon, Pettigrew carried the bundle of bones and the cauldron, and the ritual began. What emerged from that bubbling mixture was not merely a man, but a creature of legend returned, a tall, skeletally thin man with a face whiter than a skull, with wide, livid red eyes and a nose that was as flat as a snake's with slits for nostrils. Voldemort's new form was as monstrous as his soul, sculpted by magic to resemble the inhuman being he had become. This was no accident either. Voldemort could have fashioned a handsome body, something to deceive or charm, but he didn't care. He wanted to inspire terror. His return was a declaration of war. Every aspect of the ritual spoke of symbolism, of dominance over the past, over family, over those who defied him. His father's bones mocked Muggle abandonment. His servant's flesh declared control. His enemy's blood claimed victory. It was a ritual of power, yes, but also of narrative. Voldemort understood, as all great villains do, the importance of myth. His resurrection was theatre, dark and precise. The wand returned to his hand. "Wormtail," he cried. The Death Eaters were summoned, and though only a handful came, their presence confirmed what the wizarding world feared. "You Lucius! You Crab! You Goyle!" They bowed, afraid. The ritual had not only brought Voldemort back, it had returned the shadow of the First War. The names, the masks, the dark mark, they all flickered to life again. There was a grotesque beauty in the construction of the moment. Voldemort, with a new body and renewed power, did not merely celebrate. He used the moment to punish. He tortured Harry. He taunted his followers. He toyed with Pettigrew. The ritual, it turned out, was not the end. It was the beginning of a long night of terror. He challenged Harry to a duel, mocking the boy who had escaped him so many times. But something happened. Something Voldemort had not foreseen. Number 17. The occupation of the Ministry. The fall of the Ministry of Magic was not an explosion, not a grand battle, not even a storm in the sky. It was a whisper, a shadow crawling through the corridors, unnoticed until it was far too late. For all the legends of wand duels and heroic stands, the true takeover came quietly. And that was the most terrifying part. Lord Voldemort did not need to break down the doors when he could instead open them from the inside. His invasion began not with curses, but with the cold hand of control, and the first to feel it was Pius Thicknesser. Thickness, once the head of the Department of Magical Law Enforcement, was an influential figure within the ministry, respected, dutiful, and trusted. And it was precisely this trust that made him the perfect pawn. Under the imperious curse, his free will was stolen, his eyes hollowed of resistance. He became the first domino, placed carefully by Yaxley, who served Voldemort with ruthless loyalty. Through Pius, Voldemort did not just get a man, he got a key. With Thicknesser in place, other officials were gradually replaced or subdued. The strategy was elegantly cruel. There were no dark marks in the sky, no alarms ringing. Instead, documents were signed under subtle coercion, laws passed under subtle threats. Dolores Umbridge, already tainted by her time at Hogwarts, found herself rising once more, this time not through ambition alone, but as a tool of tyranny. Magic is might. That was the new slogan etched into the walls of the rebranded ministry. Gone was the benevolent bureaucracy, flawed though it had always been. In its place stood an institution draped in fear. The statue in the atrium, once a symbol of unity, now depicted Muggles being crushed under the weight of a towering wizard. The imagery was not accidental. It was policy turned into sculpture. Voldemort knew symbols mattered. Harry, Hermione, and Ron realized the scale of the infiltration too late. While they were on the run, gathering clues for the Horcruxes, the Ministry had already been weaponized against them. Every document, every warrant, every broadcast now worked in favor of the Dark Lord. The Daily Prophet became a machine of misinformation, branding Harry as undesirable number one and Hermione as a mudblood menace. Truth was not silenced, it was rewritten. Undesirable number one, said the poster, which was seen across Britain. Harry's face, scowling and surrounded by thick lettering, stared from walls and newspapers. But behind this public image was a vast surveillance network that the trio would only fully comprehend during their infiltration into the ministry. The magical government had transformed into a web of paranoia. Those who questioned it disappeared. Those who resisted were investigated. Those who ran, hunted. The courtrooms were perhaps the darkest element of Voldemort's new regime. Under Umbridge's lead, trials were no longer about justice, but about cleansing. Muggle-born witches and wizards were dragged before the Wizengamot, accused of stealing magic, forced to prove their heritage, or be sent to Azkaban. or worse. Hermione saw it firsthand, wearing the identity of Mafalda Hopkirk during their infiltration. She watched as a terrified woman pleaded for her life, while Umbridge, in full pink regalia, handed down a sentence without flinching. "Now I ask again, what is your blood status?" Umbridge's voice echoed in the chamber, laced with venom. But even as she wore a kitten-adorned cardigan, she presided over a tribunal that mirrored the darkest authoritarian horrors of the Muggle world. The irony was sharp and intentional. Cruelty disguised as order, oppression masquerading as law. The Ministry's fall was also psychological. It shifted the collective heartbeat of the magical community. People no longer trusted their neighbors. Flu networks were monitored, owls intercepted, and even speaking the name Voldemort triggered magical detection. The taboo, a spell that summoned snatchers when his name was uttered, silenced the last rebellion of language. Fear replaced defiance. People stopped saying what they believed, then they stopped believing it at all. For Harry, the realization hit hardest when he witnessed the Ministry's corruption not as an abstract idea, but as a lived nightmare. Disguised as Runcorn, he roamed the halls of power, watching as workers forged lies into truth, as fear clouded every corridor. He saw a worker weeping at her desk, shredding photographs of her Muggle-born husband, not because she wanted to, but because the Ministry had demanded it. This was not war, it was submission. It was the erosion of morality, one form, one decree, one cursed pen stroke at a time. It was Kingsley Shacklebolt who described the situation best in his coded messages to the Order. "The Ministry has fallen. Scrimgeour is dead. They are coming." These simple words, carried by Patronus to those still willing to listen, became the anthem of the resistance. But they came too late for many. Rufus Scrimgeour had tried, in his own flawed way, to hold the Ministry together. He had even died refusing to give away Harry's location. But in the end, courage was no match for infiltration. The regime didn't need to defeat him in public. They simply eliminated him, and with him the last thread of legitimacy. The takeover of the Ministry was Voldemort's most strategic move. It gave him access to the entire magical infrastructure, records, registries, and enforcement powers. It gave him control without visibility. The wizarding world still functioned, trains still ran, schools still opened, papers were still printed, but everything was poisoned. Every choice made by the public came from fear or misinformation. Even the Hogwarts Express, once a symbol of innocence and magic, now transported children under watchful eyes. The new headmaster, Severus Snape, though secretly loyal to Dumbledore, presided over a school ruled by Carrows and Payne. The Ministry had extended its claws even into the classroom, shaping minds as much as it punished bodies. Number 18, the trap at the Lovegoods house. There was something unsettling about the Lovegood residence long before Harry, Ron, and Hermione set foot inside. It wasn't just the crooked appearance of the building, rising like a tower from the hills beyond Ottery St. Catchpole, or the way the stone walls seemed to lean toward one another, as if whispering secrets. It was the silence that greeted them, too profound, too watchful. As the trio approached that day, still cloaked under the weight of their mission and the burden of their hunted status, they had no idea that the very home they had hoped would be a sanctuary had already become a snare. Xenophilius Lovegood had once been a curious and eccentric figure on the sidelines of the magical world. Editor of the Quibbler, he was known for his wild theories and unconventional thinking. But for all his oddities, he had printed pro-Harry messages when no one else dared to. That alone gave him a place in the minds of the trio as someone they could trust. Yet Voldemort had changed the rules. No longer content to threaten from the shadows, he had begun a campaign of psychological warfare, one that turned friends into enemies and used love itself as a weapon. By the time Harry and his friends arrived, Xenophilius had already been broken, not by torture, but by fear for his daughter's life. Luna Lovegood had always been peculiar, even among Hogwarts students, but behind her dreamy gaze and drifting thoughts was a fiercely loyal soul. Her abduction had been silent, efficient, and devastating. The Death Eaters had not needed to hurt her. The mere act of taking her was enough to control her father. And Xenophilius, though he had once mocked the ministry's propaganda, now stood as a living symbol of its effectiveness, a man willing to betray the boy who lived if it meant saving the only family he had left. The trap was elegant in its simplicity. By feigning normalcy, Xenophilius lured Harry, Ron, and Hermione into the belief that they were safe, that they could trust him. He welcomed them in, offered conversation, even spoke of the Deathly Hallows, fitting since his family crest bore the mark. But there was an urgency in his eyes, a twitching of his fingers that belied his calm demeanour. He was waiting for something. And while Hermione carefully analysed every symbol, and Ron shifted uncomfortably by the strange furnishings, Harry felt the weight of unseen danger pressing in. It wasn't until Xenophilius stepped away to summon help, pretending to fetch refreshments, that the illusion began to shatter. Harry moved toward a bookshelf. Hermione knelt near a curious cauldron filled with boiling nettles, and Ron kept watch at the door. It was Hermione who first noticed the framed picture, an empty space where Luna's face should have been. And then Harry saw it too, a stack of the Quibbler issues, no longer praising him, but now filled with retractions and twisted stories. The realization hit like a curse. They were not guests, they were bait. The Death Eaters arrived almost immediately. There were 3 of them, Selwyn, Travers, and an unnamed figure cloaked in black. They did not knock. There was no pretense of civility. The house, already peculiar, seemed to warp further under the weight of their presence. Xenophilius stood near the fireplace, trembling, caught between terror and guilt. "They've got Luna," he whispered, barely audible, but the damage had been done. The wards had fallen. The house was no longer a shelter. It was a cage. In those first seconds, time fractured. Ron pulled his wand. Hermione screamed a spell. Harry stood still, fury boiling in his chest, but magic within such a confined space turned wild. The structure of the house groaned under the weight of conflicting enchantments. A ricocheting curse shattered a chandelier, sending crystal shards raining down like deadly snow. Xenophilius fell to his knees, covering his head, sobbing. "I had no choice," he wept. "They'll kill her." Hermione's brilliance emerged in that chaos. While Ron held off Selwyn with a barrage of defensive spells, she unleashed a spell so potent that it split the floorboards. The house began to collapse, not from physical destruction alone, but from the sheer overload of magical energy. "We need to disapparate," she shouted, grasping Harry's arm, but Harry hesitated. He looked at Xenophilius, broken, defeated, guilty, and for a moment his anger flared, and then he turned away. With a final spell, Hermione shattered the room's central beam, causing the ceiling to sag and crack. Dust engulfed the trio as they vanished, apparating away into the wilderness. The trap had failed, but only barely. They had escaped not because of strength or preparation, but because of desperation and luck. And yet the event marked something far more insidious, a shift in Voldemort's tactics, a warning written in the wreckage of an eccentric wizard's house. This was not a random act of aggression. Voldemort had made a calculated move. He had shown the world that no one was untouchable. The Lovegoods were not warriors or soldiers. They were quirky intellectuals, but they were useful as pawns. By targeting Luna, he didn't just hope to snare Harry. He aimed to instill doubt in every heart within the resistance. If the daughter of Xenophilius Lovegood could be taken, who else was safe? The psychological impact of the event rippled far beyond the ruined house. Among the Order of the Phoenix, fear began to surface in whispered conversations. Could their families be used the same way? Were their secrets truly hidden? Kingsley Shacklebolt doubled his efforts to protect Muggle-borns. Arthur Weasley began sleeping in his cloak, wand at the ready. Even Tonks, already on edge from the war, found herself waking in cold sweats, clutching her swollen belly. For Harry, the experience was a cruel reminder that being the chosen one came at a cost. He had not simply been hunted, he had been used to lure others into traps. This was a war of attrition now, where hearts and minds were as much a battlefield as forests and alleyways. Hermione, usually composed, broke down that night beside a makeshift campfire. "It's not just about Horcruxes anymore," she whispered. "He's trying to break us before we even face him." The tragedy was compounded by the knowledge that Xenophilius had not been evil. He had not been a Death Eater, nor a traitor. In the usual sense, he was a father, and in a world where Voldemort held the strings, love itself could become a liability. The Dark Lord had weaponized affection, twisted it into something dangerous. Luna's pale eyes, once filled with serene wonder, now haunted Harry in dreams. She had not cried when taken. She had smiled softly, bravely, before vanishing into the dark. Her father's soul had crumbled at that image. The moment would later be discussed in many whispered tales. Some would exaggerate the destruction of the house, claiming it had exploded in a mushroom cloud of silver fire. Others would paint Xenophilius as a coward, ignoring the terrible choice he had been forced to make. But the truth was simpler, sadder. He was a man caught in a snare that no amount of logic or bravery could unravel. In the words of Dumbledore, once written in an old letter, "It is our choices that show what we truly are, far more than our abilities." But what choice did Xenophilius really have? The Lovegood incident became a symbol, a quiet warning etched into the history of the Resistance. It was studied, analysed, and retold among the members of Dumbledore's army. Neville Longbottom would later speak of it in the Room of Requirement, reminding younger students that loyalty alone was no longer enough. "You have to protect your family," he said, "because Voldemort won't play fair. He'll make you pick your loved ones or your cause." The memory lingered for Harry most during nights in the tent, when the wind howled like the voices of the lost. He thought often of Luna, imagined her humming softly in a cell beneath Malfoy Manor, her feet bare, her hair uncombed. He wondered what stories she told herself to stay sane. He wondered if she still believed in Nargles. And yet, there was hope. Luna's eventual rescue, during the daring escape led by Dobby, brought a measure of redemption to the dark tale. She returned not broken, but serene, her faith in her friends unshaken. "I always knew you'd come," she told Harry with a smile. Her light had survived the storm, but her father's guilt never faded. Xenophilius faded from public life, his magazine lost to irrelevance, his eyes dimmer, his steps slower. The trap at the Lovegood's house was not just a failed ambush, it was a shift in the narrative of the war. It marked the point where Voldemort ceased to be merely a tyrant and became something worse, a manipulator of emotion, a puppeteer of pain. And from that moment on, every decision Harry made carried the added weight of unintended consequences. Even the greatest heroes, it seemed, were not immune to traps woven from love. Number 19, Professor Quirrell and the Chess Game in the Shadows. Of all the dark mysteries hidden within the stone walls of Hogwarts, few are as intricately layered as the tale of Professor Quirinus Quirrell. To the untrained eye, he was little more than a stammering wreck of a man, the sort of figure most students dismissed with polite disinterest. But beneath the surface of trembling hands and garlic-scented robes was a soul already swallowed whole by the Dark Lord. That first year, the year that seemed almost whimsical in memory, the year of chocolate frogs, magical feasts, and new friendships, was in truth a chessboard. Every step Harry Potter took across the marble floors was part of a far more sinister game. At the heart of it all, seated silently in the shadows, was Quirrell, and behind him, hidden under a turban, was Lord Voldemort himself. From the moment Harry arrived at Hogwarts, the game had begun. The enchantment of the castle did not shield him from danger, it only disguised it. Quirrell was already in place, already compromised, already enslaved. He had travelled the world the year before under the guise of academic pursuit, but he returned not with wisdom, but with possession. "He is with me wherever I go," Quirrell would later admit, trembling, though not from fear, but from the agony of bearing the parasitic presence of Voldemort. The first significant move on the board was the attempted theft of the Philosopher's Stone at Gringotts. Harry only learned this much later, but the fact remains. It happened the very day he was introduced to the wizarding world. Quirrell failed in that attempt, thwarted by the protections of Gringotts goblins. Yet even in failure, the game continued. Quirrell returned to Hogwarts, now tasked with a more dangerous and subtle mission to retrieve the stone from within the school itself. And he began to play not with brute force but with strategy, deception, and patience. He did not move against Harry directly at first. That would have been too obvious. Instead, Quirrell tested the waters of Hogwarts security and simultaneously kept Dumbledore off balance. One of the most calculated moves came on Halloween night, when a mountain troll was released into the castle. To most, it seemed a random act of chaos, perhaps the foolish mistake of a weak teacher. But it was no accident. The troll had been guided, weaponized as a distraction. While teachers and students scrambled in fear, Quirrell slipped away, attempting to reach the stone's hiding place. What he didn't expect was that Harry, Ron, and Hermione would stumble into the very corridor where the three-headed dog Fluffy stood guard. The children survived, but they had now entered the board. They were no longer just students, they were pieces in motion. Voldemort underestimated them, particularly Harry. And in doing so he began to make mistakes. Yet Quirrell, under orders, did not stop. In the weeks that followed, the game escalated. Harry's broomstick was cursed during a Quidditch match. It was Quirrell, Dumbledore would later confirm, though at the time the trio suspected Snape. In the stands, Hermione saw Snape muttering and assumed he was the culprit. But in truth, Snape was performing a countercurse. Quirrell had taken position on the opposite side of the field, whispering hexes as Harry soared through the air. It was another calculated move, bold, dangerous, but deniable. Voldemort was probing, testing the magical barriers around the boy. Harry's survival once again confirmed what Voldemort feared. There was more to this child than met the eye. But Quirrell's strategies didn't rely on brute strength. They were like shadows creeping along the edge of candlelight, subtle, silent, sinister. He lured Harry to the Forbidden Forest under the pretense of detention, where he drank unicorn blood, desperate to sustain the cursed life within him. "The blood of a unicorn will keep you alive, even if you are an inch from death," Firenze told Harry. But it came at a terrible price. That night, for the first time, Harry saw what evil truly looked like. A hooded figure slithering across the earth, feeding on the innocent. It left an indelible mark on him, not just the scar, but in the soul. What made Quirrell's manipulation so effective was how thoroughly he disguised them as weakness. He stuttered, he flinched, he kept to himself, but all the while he was watching, listening, moving pieces across the board. He charmed Fluffy to sleep with a harp. He navigated the magical protections left by the other professors, enchantments that should have been impenetrable. Yet he outwitted them. He passed through the devil's snare laid by Sprout, solved the logic puzzle of Snape's potions, and even mastered the enchanted keys. But perhaps most telling of his cunning was his understanding of the mirror. Dumbledore had placed the Philosopher's Stone within the Mirror of Erised, a magical artifact that reveals the deepest desire of the person who looks into it. For most, this would have been a psychological trap. But Voldemort knew Harry. He understood the boy's heart in a way few others did. And so, when Harry finally came face to face with Quirrell, with Voldemort's voice hissing from within him, the moment became a trial not of strength, but of will. "Use the boy, the voice instructed. Quirrell tried, and Harry resisted. In that moment, it wasn't spells or wand work that saved him. It was love. The protective enchantment left by Lily Potter, her sacrificial act, manifested in a way Voldemort had not foreseen. When Quirrell touched Harry, his skin burned. He screamed. He crumbled. The game ended not with a checkmate, but with a backlash so fierce that it shattered Quirrell's body and forced Voldemort into the void once more. And yet what makes this story so chilling is not just the evil that Quirrell carried within him, but how close he came to success. He was within inches of immortality, hidden within the very heart of Hogwarts, surrounded by the greatest minds of the magical world. Dumbledore himself, wise and ancient, was distracted. "I was gone because I received an urgent owl from the ministry," he told Harry later. But even that may have been manipulation, another distraction orchestrated by Quirrell or the Dark Lord. The lesson here is terrifying in its simplicity. The enemy was already inside the walls. He did not knock. He did not break in. He walked through the front doors, greeted the staff, taught the students, and bowed his head at feasts. No alarms rang, no suspicions confirmed. Evil came not with a roar, but with a whisper. Throughout the year, Harry was unknowingly measured and tested. Voldemort did not merely want the stone, he wanted to understand the boy. Who was he? What magic protected him? How had he survived the killing curse? These were not just questions of curiosity, they were the obsessions of a fractured soul seeking rebirth. And Quirrell, in his own way, was the perfect instrument, educated, ambitious, weak. The very traits that allowed him to be seduced and devoured. Even in death, Quirrell serves as a reminder of how easily darkness can disguise itself in the ordinary. The quiet teacher, the empty corridors, the flickering candlelight. In retrospect, it all feels so obvious. And yet at the time, nobody saw it. Not McGonagall, not Snape, not even Dumbledore. Harry, still a child, navigated this dangerous terrain with instincts rather than understanding. He followed hunches, acted with courage, and leaned on his friends. In doing so, he stumbled through a maze of traps and manipulations designed by a mind far older and darker than his own. That he emerged victorious was not fate, it was proof that even the smallest light can push back against shadows. The chess game of that first year, often overshadowed by later battles, is perhaps the most intricate of all. Each player, Dumbledore, Quirrell, Voldemort, Harry, moved with different goals, different visions, but only one emerged truly changed. Harry learned that the world was not as simple as good and evil. He saw that monsters could wear human faces and that safety was an illusion. Years later, as he would face darker threats and deeper wounds, the memory of Quirrell and that first encounter with Voldemort would remain a cornerstone of Harry's understanding. The shadows had moved, the chessboard had been set, and Harry Potter, barely 11 years old, had unknowingly won his first real war. Number 20, Mundungus Fletcher's betrayal. Of all the betrayals that haunted the Second Wizarding War, few were as jarring and consequential as that committed by Mundungus Fletcher. A man known for his greasy appearance, his ever-present stench of fire whiskey, and his endless supply of dodgy magical items, Mundungus was never someone to be trusted. And yet Albus Dumbledore, keenly aware of the risk, allowed him, in small measure, to operate within the folds of the Order of the Phoenix. Fletcher was never a warrior. He wasn't brave like Moody, loyal like Lupin, or wise like McGonagall. He was a survivor, and sometimes survivors can be far more dangerous than the most ruthless enemies. The Operation Seven Potters was one of the riskiest missions ever carried out by the Order. The plan was brilliant in its audacity. 6 decoys, each magically transformed into Harry using Polyjuice Potion, would fly to different safe houses escorted by experienced witches and wizards. Harry himself would be one of them. The deception was meant to confuse any Death Eaters who might be watching. Every route was calculated, every escort was chosen with care. There was one goal: to get Harry out of Privet Drive safely. Voldemort was hunting him now more than ever. The plan had to work. It had no room for error. But there was error. A grave one, because somewhere in the chain the details leaked. Not just the date and time, but the plan itself. The Death Eaters were not only waiting, they were prepared. It wasn't a random ambush. It was a strike at the heart of the resistance. It was personal, coordinated, merciless, and the man who whispered those secrets to the enemy, the one who bartered truth for safety, was Mundungus Fletcher. J.K. Rowling doesn't give him the dignity of a grand confrontation or a cinematic betrayal. Instead, his treachery is revealed in a quiet, pathetic unraveling. In Harry Potter and the Deathly Hallows, it is Kreacher, the Black Family house elf, who delivers the damning truth. "Mundungus Fletcher," Kreacher had bellowed. He took many things from this house, and he is the one who betrayed the order. There is no fanfare, no confession from the man himself, just a name dropped like a stone into a well of already murky trust. Mundungus had been caught by Death Eaters, cornered like a rat, and instead of dying with dignity or holding his tongue, he sold what he knew. He gave up the plan. Perhaps he thought it was harmless, that Voldemort wouldn't take the bait, that the decoys would work. But his decision cost lives. It wasn't just betrayal, it was betrayal wrapped in cowardice, soaked in the selfish instinct to save one's own skin. He wasn't just weak, he was dangerous. Alastair Moody, Mad-Eye to his comrades, paid the price. The most paranoid, most battle-hardened warrior the Order had ever known, killed in mid-air during the ambush. He never even stood a chance. The curse hit him before he could react. His body was never recovered. One of the greatest fighters against Voldemort gone, not in a glorious duel, but in a setup. The last time anyone saw him, Lupin later said, he was falling into the night. A warrior betrayed not in battle, but by trust. And then there was George. Flying with his brother Fred, laughing and joking as they always did, until a curse from Snape, meant to incapacitate a Death Eater, struck George's ear clean off. St. Mungo's couldn't heal it. Ear-related humour totally aside, I'm serious. George's hearing will never be the same, Bill Weasley told Harry days later. The Weasley twins were never the same after that. Something broke in them, not just the symmetry of their faces, but the sense of invincibility they always wore like a second skin. What makes Fletcher's betrayal even more insidious is that he didn't understand or refused to understand the war he was in. To him it was just another game, another opportunity to escape punishment. He wasn't ideological. He didn't serve Voldemort, he feared him. And sometimes fear is a more powerful motivator than hatred. Fletcher wasn't evil in the traditional sense, but he was the kind of man who, when pressed, would do anything to survive, even if it meant throwing others to the wolves. The tragedy is compounded by the fact that Dumbledore had kept Fletcher close for this very reason. "You need eyes and ears in low places," he once said to Lupin. Fletcher was a link to the underworld, a connection to the shadows. But when the shadows came knocking, Fletcher didn't stand firm. He opened the door and invited them in. Voldemort understood human weakness better than most. He didn't need to break into Gringotts or storm Hogwarts to win the war. He needed to find the cracks, the insecure, the greedy, the fearful. Wormtail was the classic case, but Fletcher was another. Both men showed how evil often rides the coattails of cowardice, and Voldemort knew how to exploit that. He didn't need to convert Fletcher, he just needed him to fold, and fold he did. The betrayal shook the Order to its core. It wasn't just about the mission gone wrong, it was about what it said regarding trust. How do you protect yourselves when the enemy wears the face of a friend? Kingsley Shacklebolt later said, "We're no longer fighting a war of spells, we're fighting a war of loyalties." Trust became a rare commodity, and paranoia grew like mold in every shadowed corner. And yet Fletcher remained at large. He wasn't brought to justice. He wasn't thrown in Azkaban or killed by vengeful comrades. He just disappeared. Slipped into the alleyways of Nocturne and vanished into that murky grey world he'd always inhabited. The war moved on without him, but the damage he left behind lingered. In a strange twist of fate, Fletcher's stolen goods later played a role in the downfall of Dolores Umbridge. The locket of Slytherin, once taken by Creature, was among the many heirlooms Fletcher pilfered from number 12 Grimmauld Place. When Harry, Ron, and Hermione learned that Umbridge had it, they hatched the plan to infiltrate the Ministry of Magic. One man's greed became another man's opportunity. Even in betrayal, the war found strange ways to balance its scales. But that doesn't erase the blood on his hands. Fletcher might not have cast the killing curse, but he lit the beacon. His whisper became the Death Eater's war cry. And every spell they flung into the sky that night, Every curse, every scream, every crash of brooms echoed the words Fletcher must have shared behind trembling lips. Some might argue that Fletcher didn't know the consequences, that he didn't think Moody would die or that George would be scarred forever. But ignorance doesn't absolve betrayal, it magnifies it. It paints it not just as selfish but as blind, and blindness in war can kill just as surely as a wand. The Order never spoke of him again, not officially. His name became a ghost, mentioned only in hushed tones, if at all. Perhaps they didn't want to admit they had trusted him. Or perhaps they feared what it said about themselves, that in the end they had made space for a snake in their garden. In Harry's own journey, Fletcher's betrayal became a quiet lesson, one among many. That people aren't always what they seem. That some enemies wear robes of friends. That trust is more powerful than any spell, but infinitely more fragile. He never confronted Fletcher. He didn't have to. The truth had already done its work. When we think of the great villains of the series, we think of Bellatrix, Voldemort, Umbridge, even Snape. But there is a special place in the tapestry of darkness for people like Mundungus Fletcher, not because they wield power, but because they give it away to those who do. In the end, Fletcher was a footnote, but footnotes can shape history. His decision cost lives, crippled heroes, and reminded the wizarding world that battles aren't always fought in the open. Some are lost in whispers, in shadows, in cowardice, and perhaps that is the hardest kind of war to fight. And yet, it also serves as a reminder of resilience, of the strength it takes to continue when trust has been shattered. The Order did not fall. Harry did not break. George found laughter again, even if it was quieter. The loss of Moody was felt, but his legacy carried on. They endured, they adapted, they moved forward, not because Fletcher didn't wound them, but because they chose not to let that wound define them. Mundungus Fletcher didn't destroy the Order, but he reminded them, and us, that the true enemy isn't always the one with a wand pointed at your heart. Sometimes it's the one standing beside you, whispering into the night. Number 21. The attack on Weasley's Wizard Wheezes. The attack did not come with a bang, nor with fire or spells flying through the air. It came in silence. It came in the form of fear creeping down the alleys of Diagon Alley like a fog that wrapped itself around the colour and joy that once emanated from Weasley's Wizard Wheezes. Fred and George Weasley had built more than a joke shop. They had built a sanctuary of laughter in a world falling to despair. But in the rise of Voldemort's new order, even joy became a crime, and those who dared sell it, targets. Weasley's Wizard. Wheezes was not simply a store, it was a symbol. In the grey and grim days following Dumbledore's death, their shop glowed like a flame in the darkness. Customers came not just for products like skiving snack boxes or extendable ears. They came to remember what it felt like to laugh without guilt, without fear. That kind of light couldn't go unnoticed, not by a regime that thrived on silence and submission. The Death Eaters didn't launch an outright assault at first. Instead, they watched. They stood across the cobbled street, dark figures cloaked and hooded, not moving, not speaking. A customer would walk in with a hesitant glance over their shoulder. Some would walk out smiling, others didn't dare return. Business began to drop, not because the shop had lost its magic, but because people had. The threat was unspoken but clear. Be seen here, and you might be seen as a sympathizer. Fred and George knew the risk. You know who can't stand people not being afraid, George had once said, half joking, but they kept the doors open, not because they were foolish, but because they understood the power of resistance in unexpected places. Humour had always been their weapon. Now it became their shield. Every fanged frisbee they sold, every decoy detonator they handed over, was an act of rebellion. The first real sign that the shop had become more than a thorn in Voldemort's side came when a quiet little girl named Bridget Willoughby was arrested. Her only crime, she had a puking pastille in her pocket. It had been a gift from her older brother, who'd saved up to buy her a birthday treat. When ministry officials, now crawling with Death Eater influence, found out it came from the Weasleys' shop. They paid a visit, not to the child, to the store. That visit wasn't public. No windows were broken, no spells cast. But the next morning, a note had been nailed to the door. Closed due to unregistered magical activity. The ink was thick, black, and pulsed faintly. An enchantment of intimidation. Fred tore it down without a word, but for the first time, George didn't make a joke. Their silence was heavier than any hex. Inside, they began fortifying, not just with protective charm, though those were layered thick as dragon hide, but with resolve. They reopened the next day. A new product appeared on the shelves, anti-inquisitorial hats, which squawked, flapped, and screamed when approached by anyone carrying a trace of ministry magic. They sold out within hours. Still, the shadow grew. Lee Jordan, now a rogue broadcaster of underground news through Potterwatch, called their shop the Beating Heart of Morale. That name turned into a target. 2 nights later, they returned from a late delivery to find the windows smashed in. No items stolen, just everything overturned, every box torn open, every joke split at the seams. A message, loud and cruel. We can touch you any time. Fred stared at the destruction, his fists clenched. George knelt near the broken remains of a Wonder Witch display, not because of the loss of inventory, but because he saw a smear of blood on the counter. One of their employees, Verity, had been working late. She was missing. No one had seen her since. The ministry claimed no knowledge. The alley refused to speak. They didn't close. They rebuilt. They started offering products for a different kind of customer. Not children looking for nosebleeds to skip class, but resistance members needing distraction devices, portable shields, and enchanted communication tools. Their shop changed. It didn't lose its colors, but it gained an edge. Weasley's Wizard Wheezes now, with real resistance inside, read a new sign, half joke, half truth. Fred, always the bolder twin, began carrying a wand on each hip. George began sleeping at the shop. They installed spells that traced every step of anyone entering. But fear remained. We're not just selling fun anymore, Fred whispered once. We're selling defiance. That has a price. That price came due during one cold evening, as the war reached its fever pitch. An explosion rocked Diagon Alley, centered not on Gringotts, nor on Ollivanders, but on Weasley's Wizard Wheezes. Flames poured out like liquid fire, swallowing the pinks and purples of the storefront. Fred and George, returning from a delivery run, arrived to find the street alight. The store, their lifework, their dream, burned with it. It wasn't a random act of war. A Death Eater named Selwyn had led it, a loyalist known for favoring fire as his method. Witnesses later said he stood watching, arms crossed, as the fire consumed the building, saying only, "Let's see them joke their way out of this." The explosion didn't kill anyone, though a young boy named Colin, who had hidden behind a product shelf, had to be pulled from the smoke. But the message, again, was precise. This wasn't just punishment, it was humiliation. Voldemort didn't need to kill the Weasleys, he needed them broken. After the attack, Fred and George didn't speak to anyone for days. The shell of their shop remained, half rubble, half ash. People came, some crying, some angry. The twins finally returned, placed a single enchanted sign on the blackened door. Still open, just a bit crispy. They operated out of the back alley for a while after that. Just a small room, hidden and warded. Their clientele changed. Mostly members of the Order, Dumbledore's army, and desperate witches and wizards who'd lost everything. They distributed enchanted coins like the ones Hermione had once made for DA meetings, and mini shield cloaks capable of deflecting low-level curses. One day, Luna Lovegood showed up, her eyes wide and dreamy as always. She placed a hand on the blackened brick and whispered, "It's still smiling." George didn't laugh, but he smiled faintly. Fred didn't speak. He simply handed her a prototype nose-biter nougat and said, "Tell them we're still here." Though the shop never returned to its former glory during the war, its ashes became a symbol. When Harry, Ron, and Hermione later returned to Diagon Alley, they found the burned structure adorned with flowers, small notes, and enchanted fireworks that went off at random. The Resistance had adopted it as a shrine, not to loss but to spirit. Even Harry felt the wound. He never said it aloud, but when he heard about the attack, something inside him crumbled. In a way, Voldemort had struck closer than ever before, not with a curse, not with a duel, but by desecrating a place Harry had always associated with hope. The world had gotten darker, he would later write in his personal notes, but the twins had always been the light. Years later, after the war had ended and peace shakily returned, George rebuilt. He kept the scorch marks on the brick, enchanted so they could never be cleaned. Fred was gone by then, fallen in the Battle of Hogwarts. But his presence lingered. Every shelf that restocked, every child that laughed, was part of the Resistance continuing. There is no plaque outside Weasley's Wizard Wheezes to commemorate the attack. No ministry-issued acknowledgement, but those who walk the alley and know the story pause at that one brick, still marked by flame, and tip their hats, because Voldemort had tried to burn joy, but joy, like a phoenix, always rises from ashes. Number 22, Carrow's Cruciatus Curse on Neville. When the Death Eaters took over Hogwarts, the ancient castle did not fall with the grandeur of a crumbling tower or the violence of a siege. It fell silently, like a shadow stretching over the walls. Ministry control, backed by Voldemort's silent decree, turned the once safe halls into corridors of dread. The ghosts grew quiet. The portraits whispered warnings. And amid it all, a boy who had once been clumsy, forgetful, and mocked even by his own friends, found the strength to remain. Neville Longbottom did not run. He did not hide. He stayed. While most of the students who opposed the new regime chose to disappear into the Forbidden Forest or found ways to flee Hogwarts altogether, Neville did something far more dangerous. He formed Dumbledore's army again, not in name only, but in spirit. Under the very noses of Alecto and Amicus Carrow, he organized meetings, led sabotage efforts, and created safe passages through the castle's secret tunnels. As others fell into line under the pressure of fear, Neville stood taller. He turned the Room of Requirement into a sanctuary, a stronghold, a last bastion of hope. The Carrows, siblings in cruelty, relished their newfound authority. Amicus, in particular, took perverse pleasure in twisting the ideals of magical education. He transformed defense against the dark arts into a study of aggression, hate, and punishment. And when he needed to send a message, when whispers of rebellion reached his ears, he chose not to expel but to break. Neville became his target not just because he disobeyed, but because he inspired others to do the same. Amicus Carrow understood the mechanics of fear better than most. Pain was only the beginning. What mattered more was spectacle. In the Great Hall, before rows of frightened first years and silent sixth years, he made an example of Neville again and again. "Let them see," Carrow would sneer, dragging Neville into the centre of the room. "Let them learn what defiance earns." And then he would cast it. The Cruciatus Curse, an unforgivable, its very name echoed history soaked in pain. Crucio, torture. Neville never screamed, not the way Carrow wanted. His body convulsed, his breath caught, his fingers clawed at stone, but he refused to cry out. That silence was louder than any scream. It echoed off the enchanted ceiling of the Great Hall and into the hearts of the watching students. And while Amicus's curse burned nerve endings and twisted muscles, Neville held on to something deeper than pain. He held on to purpose. The others saw it. Lavender Brown wept behind her books. Seamus clenched his fists under the table. Even students who had once laughed at Neville's forgetfulness now stared with a mixture of horror and awe. Because this wasn't a boy being punished. This was a boy enduring for them. "I'll do the talking, Neville," Harry had once said back in their 5th year. "You're not very good at it." But now Neville didn't need words. His body, bruised, burned, barely able to stand, spoke volumes. He had become the voice of resistance. The Cruciatus curse is not like physical injury. It doesn't leave clean scars. It invades the mind, takes residence in the soul. It's a violation, a corrosion of the will. Bellatrix Lestrange once famously used it on Neville's parents until they lost their sanity. The Longbottom name carried with it a legacy of torment, and now Amicus Carrow ensured the curse passed to the next generation. Yet Neville did not break. Even as his back bent under the force of repeated hexes, even as he limped back to the room of requirement with help from Ginny Weasley and Luna Lovegood, even as sleep brought night terrors that echoed his screams into enchanted stone walls, he rose again, every day, every time. That was what broke Carrow more than any spell could. There was one particular punishment, one winter evening, when snow pressed against the castle windows like a silenced witness, where Amicus lost all semblance of restraint. Caught after sabotaging the suits of armour near the dungeons, Neville was dragged before the entire Slytherin house. Carrow did not wait for a trial or a reason. He simply struck. The Cruciatus hit like lightning. Neville fell hard. His wand rolled away. Carrow grinned. "This is what happens," he barked. "This is what your little heroes earn." But Neville stood, blood on his lip, hands shaking. "Then I'll earn it again," he said. Those words were never written in any prophet article, but the walls of Hogwarts remembered. So did the students. It was no longer about fear. It was about fire, quiet, smouldering fire. Amicus tried to isolate him, forbidding other students from assisting him. He confiscated supplies, banned food deliveries to the room of requirement, and sent patrols to search for signs of the resistance. But every measure only hardened Neville further. The room began to respond to him as if it, too, had chosen a side. Beds, food, even protective enchantments began appearing on their own. Magic itself rallied to him. Even Filch, once a laughingstock, looked away when Neville limped past. There were lines that even the cruel did not cross. Yet the Carrows kept crossing. One day, when a third year was caught trying to smuggle a note to her brother in Ravenclaw Tower, Amicus announced a collective punishment. The girl would be spared, but someone would take her place. And he chose Neville again, Luna Lovegood protested. Amicus struck her across the face. Ginny tried to intervene. Alecto hexed her unconscious, but Neville stepped forward. The Cruciatus landed harder that day, and still, no scream, only breath, ragged but defiant. It is one thing to suffer, it is another to suffer repeatedly, publicly, and still refuse to give your tormentor what he wants. Carrow wanted obedience. Neville gave him silence. Carrow wanted screams. Neville gave him stares. Seamus Finnegan would later recall. He looked like he'd already seen the worst they could do, and he wasn't afraid of it anymore. Pain becomes part of you after a while. It shapes your steps, slows your gait, tightens your jaw. But for Neville, it became armor. Not invincible, but unbreakable. When Harry, Ron, and Hermione returned to Hogwarts for the final battle, Neville met them at the room of requirement. His hair was longer, his eyes older, his clothes battle-worn. "You been leading them?" Harry asked. Neville nodded. Someone had to. He showed them the tunnels he had mapped, the passwords he had changed, the codes he had devised, but most of all, he showed them resolve. During the Battle of Hogwarts, as the giants tore through the gates and spells turned the air into lightning, Neville led the charge like a seasoned general. It was not a sudden transformation. It was the result of every curse, every blow, every humiliating fall at Carrow's feet. Pain had forged him. Later, after the battle, when the dead were counted and silence finally returned to the halls, someone found Amicus Carrow's wand snapped in two. No one claimed credit. But some say it was Neville who did it, quietly, in the corner of the shattered Great Hall. And perhaps the greatest punishment of all for Amicus Carrow was that his torment had failed. Not only had Neville not broken, he had become legend. In time, young students would whisper his name, not with pity, but pride. He had become more than a boy. He had become a symbol. Minerva McGonagall would later tell a first-year Hufflepuff, when Hogwarts was at its darkest, it was Neville Longbottom who kept the flame lit. She didn't say this to flatter, she said it to teach. Amicus Carrow vanished after the war. Some say he was imprisoned in Azkaban. Others claim he fled the country. But even in his absence, the ghost of his failure haunted the ruins he left behind. Pain can shatter, but sometimes pain sculpts. Neville Longbottom became a professor at Hogwarts years later. He taught herbology. But every now and then he would stop by the Defense Against the Dark Arts classroom, tracing his fingers along the edges of the desk where Amicus once sat. Students would ask why. He would only smile, because in the end it wasn't magic or might that won, it was will, pure, defiant, unyielding will, and no curse, not even the Cruciatus, could crush that. Number 23, the trap at Malfoy Manor. The escape from Gringotts was a violent blaze of fire and fury, but it was only the beginning. As the trio, Harry, Ron and Hermione, disapparated away from the crumbling ruins of the Wizarding Bank, they landed not in safety but into something far worse. The Malfoy Manor, perched like a vulture on the hills of Wiltshire, awaited them like an open maw, silent and calculating. The magic that pulled them there was no accident. It was a carefully laid snare, one that almost succeeded in ending their journey prematurely. Their arrival was chaotic, bruised and scorched from the dragon escape. They had no time to consider their surroundings before the cold walls and the even colder voices greeted them. The first face they saw was that of Narcissa Malfoy, pale and sharp, her eyes scanning them not with recognition, but with suspicion. Bellatrix Lestrange's arrival turned the uncertainty into a nightmare. A flash of light revealed the face of Harry Potter, bruised but unmistakable, and the spark ignited the fire. The trio was captured, but Harry, with his face distorted by a stinging jinx, bought them precious moments. "We shall not touch him," Bellatrix insisted, fear leaking through her voice. Even in her madness, she knew the wrath Voldemort would bring if Potter were harmed. Yet the others, Lucius, Narcissa and Draco, hovered at the edges, their loyalty decaying beneath the weight of terror. The manor, once a proud estate, had turned into a prison of its own making, held hostage by the very master they pledged to serve. But it was Hermione who bore the worst. In the dungeons below, with iron bars and stone walls as her witness, she was dragged into a torture not of pain alone, but of cunning. Bellatrix did not slice her flesh for pleasure. Though her methods were sadistic, she had a purpose. The sword of Gryffindor, gleaming and real, was not supposed to be in their possession. Bellatrix had kept the true sword hidden in her Gringotts vault. If this one was real, it meant her vault had been compromised. Panic overtook her, not just rage. Hermione was stripped of her defences and pressed under the Cruciatus curse, a scream echoing against the cellar walls. Ron bellowed in fury, clawing at the bars as if sheer will could rip metal apart. Harry stared, frozen in his own helplessness, realizing that bravery meant nothing without action. Upstairs, Bellatrix's voice was shrill with both threat and desperation. "Where did you get this sword?" she demanded. Hermione did not answer. Her silence was an act of rebellion, one that cost her dearly. The trap at Malfoy Manor was not a chaotic ambush. It was a chess move. The Death Eaters recognized the trio's value not merely in capturing Harry, but in accessing secrets, the very foundation of Voldemort's survival. Harry had no Horcrux with him, no weapon beyond his wand, but Bellatrix smelled secrets in the air, and secrets were more dangerous than spells. The trio were not prisoners, they were bait, a lure to draw out information, to summon Voldemort for the final blow. The manor itself mirrored the trap, the winding corridors, the walls whispering history, the portraits whose eyes followed every movement. The grandeur had become grotesque. Chandeliers no longer sparkled. They loomed like cages of crystal. The tapestry of the noble house of Black hung not with pride, but with a kind of exhausted gloom, as if it, too, was waiting for the war to end. The house had become a character in this scene, its silence menacing. Draco Malfoy, once full of arrogant certainty at Hogwarts, now stood unsure. Bellatrix ordered him to confirm Harry's identity. He hesitated. "I can't be sure," he muttered. But he was. He simply didn't want to be part of it anymore. The trap was suffocating them all, even its architects. Draco's eyes met Harry's for a moment, and something passed between them. Not friendship, but recognition of shared entrapment. Downstairs, Luna Lovegood and Dean Thomas huddled in the corner of the cellar, shadows of hope. Mr. Ollivander, thin as air, barely spoke. The walls were heavy with despair, but it was Dobby's sudden arrival that changed everything. A crack, a whisper, and then the elf appeared, loyal, shaking, fearless. "Dobby has come to rescue Harry Potter," he said, and the tide began to turn. A creature once treated like vermin had become the thread of salvation. Dobby did not act with blind courage. His plan was deliberate. He disarmed the guards, helped Luna and Dean escape, and then returned. The elf's magic was different, unpredictable, powerful, ancient. Bellatrix sensed something was shifting. Her threats grew louder. She drew a knife. She knew that Voldemort was on his way, and if she could not extract the truth from Hermione, she could at least bring him Potter in chains. The skirmish that followed was fast, chaotic. Wormtail, ever the coward, hesitated. Harry and Ron broke free. Lucius fumbled. Narcissa shouted. Bellatrix grabbed Hermione, held a blade to her throat. Dobby stood, defiant, his hand raised. "You shall not harm Harry Potter's friends," he said. The chandelier above them trembled. With a blast, it fell, crashing down and separating Hermione from her captor. In that brief instant they disapparated, but even victory had its price. As they vanished from the manor's grip, Bellatrix's knife spun in the air and struck Dobby. They landed on the beach, freedom at last, only to find blood on the sand. "Such a beautiful place to be with friends," the elf whispered, and then was still. The trap had failed, but not without a final sting. The moment was devastating, not for its violence, but for its clarity. Even in war, innocence bleeds. The Malfoy Manor trap marked a turning point. Harry understood now fully that Voldemort was not just a monster of brute force. He was a strategist, one who planted snares through loyal followers and waited in the dark. The use of the Malfoys' home, once a sanctuary for blood purity, now a stage for horror, showed how Voldemort corrupted not just lives, but legacies. Every corner of the wizarding world was touched by him, no house too proud, no name too noble. This scene was not an action sequence, it was psychological warfare. Torture, intimidation, and hesitation collided in those rooms. The agony Hermione endured was not senseless, it was calculated. The cruelty served a purpose. Even Bellatrix's madness had structure. She was protecting Voldemort's secret without even knowing it. The irony was cruel. Her own vault held a Horcrux, and her panic over the sword nearly exposed it. In Harry Potter and the Deathly Hallows, the lines between loyalty and fear were drawn with razor blades. Draco's silence, Narcissa's unreadable face, Lucius's desperation, all signs that Voldemort's allies were fraying. The trap did not just capture Harry, it revealed that the Dark Lord's grip, though powerful, was becoming brittle. The longer he ruled, the more his followers cracked under the pressure of his perfectionism and paranoia. The rescue at Malfoy Manor was not the triumph of power, but of love. Dobby acted not for glory or revenge, but out of pure devotion. In a world ruled by fear, that kind of loyalty was a weapon Voldemort never understood. Here lies Dobby, a free elf, they carved into the stone. But more than that, he was a symbol. His defiance broke the manor's hold more than any spell could. Looking back, this moment wasn't just a chapter in the journey, it was a warning. The trio could no longer afford to act recklessly. The net was closing. They had survived not by strength alone, but by sacrifice, Dobby's, Hermione's, and their own. Malfoy Manor reminded them that the war was not just about finding Horcruxes, it was about resisting the slow pull of fear, the temptation to surrender. The elegance of the trap was its simplicity, no elaborate illusions, no decoys, just one moment of vulnerability, one accidental displacement, and the prey had walked into the predator's lair. Had it not been for Dobby, the war would have ended that night. Bellatrix would have delivered them to Voldemort. The prophecy would have died on the cold stone floor, beside a broken wand and a bloodied girl. And yet, even with all its cruelty, the manor gave them a gift. It peeled back the curtain. Harry saw how close evil was to collapse. The Malfoys were no longer villains. They were shadows of who they once were. The Death Eaters were not a brotherhood of terror, but a gallery of cowards held together by one man's venomous vision. That knowledge became a weapon in itself. In the final battles that followed, Harry would remember this. The dungeon, the screams, the elf's final breath, the pain, the fear, and the courage born from both. The trap at Malfoy Manor was not just a near-death experience. It was a crucible, one that melted away the last illusions of safety and forged them into something stronger. They were not just fighting for survival anymore. They were fighting to reclaim their world from the shadows. Number 24. The takeover of the Daily Prophet. The war did not begin with a duel, nor did it announce itself with flashes of wands or cries of pain. It began with ink, with columns of lies printed on cheap paper, with headlines that rewrote the truth and erased the names of the brave. Lord Voldemort understood something most wizards overlooked, that control over minds was as potent as control over magic. And so, in the shadows of the Second Wizarding War, before the Ministry itself fell, the Dark Lord turned his gaze toward the Daily Prophet, most trusted news outlet in the British magical world. The takeover was not sudden. It crept in like a draft through a cracked window, barely noticed at first, then impossible to ignore. One by one, journalists were replaced. Subtle changes appeared in the paper. Articles that once questioned the ministry's actions now praised them. Skepticism gave way to praise. Where Rita Skeeter had once exaggerated the truth for personal gain, now her successors buried it for political obedience. And then came the day when Albus Dumbledore, once the shining emblem of resistance, was declared a dangerous manipulator. Dumbledore, Dark Secrets, and the Darker Truths read one infamously venomous headline. After Dumbledore's death, a vacuum formed, not only of leadership but of narrative. Voldemort filled it with propaganda. The prophet became his voice, a tool for discrediting opponents and rewriting the moral compass of the magical community. Harry Potter, the symbol of hope for so many, was labeled an outlaw. His name became forbidden, his image scrubbed from the page. Where once his victories over Voldemort were lauded, now he was an enemy of the state. Undesirable number 1, that was the label printed beneath his name, distributed in posters and daily issues like a mark of plague. But it was not just about lies, it was about fear. The control was total. The prophet began to speak in a language that twisted the minds of those who read it. Phrases like, "for the greater good," and "protecting wizarding purity" became common. The shift was so insidious that many didn't realize they had adopted the ideology of the very man they had once feared. Fear became habit. Habit became loyalty. The public was not convinced. They were subdued. Behind the scenes, the editor-in-chief of the Daily Prophet had changed. Barnabas Cuff, who once attempted a balanced editorial line, vanished from public view. In his place came individuals whose names did not appear on the masthead. Anonymous decisions ruled the press. "Orders from the top," they said, though no one named the top. It didn't need naming. Everyone knew who ruled now. The power of the Daily Prophet lay in its reach. No other magical newspaper had such influence. It arrived in the hands of every wizarding household, every shopkeeper, every student at Hogwarts. What appeared in its pages became truth by default. Voldemort did not need to fight battles. He let his enemies be crushed beneath lies. He made the truth impossible to speak and dangerous to know. Nowhere was this clearer than in the enforcement of the taboo curse. In the past, the name Voldemort had been feared so deeply that only Dumbledore and his inner circle dared say it aloud. But in a bitter twist of irony, the name Harry Potter became just as cursed. A spell was woven into the very sound of it. Anyone who dared to utter his name became instantly traceable. It was a magical trap, subtle yet lethal. This tactic was not new to those who studied dark regimes, but in the magical world it took on a chilling efficiency. Harry's name was not only banned from conversation, it became a beacon. Say it once, even whisper it, and within moments, snatchers would appear. These bounty hunters, operating under the authority of the new regime, scoured the country, dragging away anyone who might harbor sympathies for the boy who lived. It was fear, not force, that silenced the resistance. Hermione Granger, always alert to magical manipulation, grasped the danger quickly. As they traveled in hiding, she forbade the use of Harry's name altogether. Even Ron, who had grown up with Harry and never learned to fear his name, understood the necessity. In Harry Potter and the Deathly Hallows, the trio learned this lesson brutally when they slipped up. The name was spoken, and instantly they were found. "It was a trap," Hermione later muttered. "Thou'll be taboo." That's how they found us. The prophet's role extended beyond mere propaganda. It rewrote history in real time. When Xenophilius Lovegood attempted to publish a defense of Harry in the Quibbler, the prophet was quick to denounce him as a traitor and lunatic. Crackpot editor Finally Cracks was their way of dismissing a voice of reason. Luna Lovegood, his daughter, was taken as a hostage shortly after. It was a clear message to all. Deviation from the official narrative would be punished not just with slander, but with suffering. The takeover of the prophet was a masterstroke of psychological warfare. The wand was no longer the weapon of choice. The pen was. Voldemort knew that a society that cannot trust its eyes or ears is easily ruled. He did not need to kill every dissenter. He needed to make sure no one believed them. And with each lie printed, with each rumor repeated, the truth faded like ink left in the rain. Even Hogwarts fell under the influence of this propaganda machine. Children brought the prophet to school and read its pages during breakfast, absorbing its venom. Muggle-born students vanished, and the paper said nothing. When Snape became headmaster, the paper praised the new discipline and order. It was not merely a newspaper now, it was a mirror of a world turning darker with each passing day. Dolores Umbridge, who returned to prominence under the new regime, was among the most active proponents of this new order. She published educational decrees and statements through the prophet that legitimized every cruelty. Her face often adorned the front page, a symbol of bureaucratic tyranny. It was through her influence that Muggle-born registration began, and the prophet helped sell it as a necessary safeguard. The silence of the prophet regarding key events was as telling as its lies. When Death Eaters attacked the Quidditch World Cup, it was reported as a disturbance. When Rufus Scrimgeour disappeared, his resignation was graceful. When Charity Burbage was murdered, her absence was not mentioned. And when Severus Snape killed Dumbledore, the headline read, "Dumbledore's final mistake." In the face of such manipulation, the Order of the Phoenix turned to underground methods. They passed information by word of mouth, by enchanted coins, and by secret gatherings. The radio broadcast Potter Watch, hosted by Lee Jordan, and codenamed River, became the only trusted voice. "The truth is being buried," Jordan once said, "so we're going to dig it up again." But for most wizards and witches, the prophet remained their only source of news. And so they obeyed. They feared. They doubted their neighbors. They avoided names. A new language of silence took root, one that required no spell, only submission. Even after Voldemort's fall, the stain remained. The prophet was never quite trusted the same way again. Its editors offered apologies, claimed coercion, but the damage had been done. As Kingsley Shacklebolt took over the ministry, reforms were promised. New journalists were hired. Truth commissions were formed. But the lesson was seared into memory. When the press becomes a wand of oppression, even heroes become hunted. Among the ruins of war, survivors told their stories. Neville Longbottom recounted how he and the DA passed forbidden news to students, risking punishment to counter the lies of the prophet. Molly Weasley spoke of tearing pages from the newspaper, unable to bear seeing Harry's name defiled. "We knew the truth," she said, "but it hurt to see the lies." One article, saved by Hermione, became a symbol of everything that had gone wrong. It was a special issue from the prophet, dated just after the fall of the Ministry. Its headline read, "A New Dawn for Wizarding Britain." Beneath it was a photo of Thickness, smiling stiffly. The photo moved, but the smile never reached his eyes. It was a perfect snapshot of a world gone mad, a smiling mask stretched over a corpse. Today, students at Hogwarts study this period not just as a war, but as a lesson in truth. In history of magic classes, they read excerpts from the prophet and compare them to first-hand accounts from the resistance. The contrast is striking. The lies are obvious in retrospect, but at the time they were gospel. The fall of the Daily Prophet was not just a journalistic failure, it was a collapse of collective conscience. It showed how fear can be disguised as order, how control can wear the costume of patriotism. And it proved that even in a world of magic, the greatest weapon is belief. In that dark year, wands flickered less than pens scratched. The damage was done not with curses but with headlines. Voldemort did not just aim to kill Harry Potter. He aimed to kill the very idea of him, to erase hope with each printed word, to make sure no one remembered what the fight was for. But they remembered, even in hiding, even in silence. They remembered the boy who lived, even when saying his name could mean death. That was Voldemort's final failure. He thought fear would erase memory, but memory, unlike newspapers, cannot be burned. Number 25, Death Eaters among the teachers. When the Ministry of Magic fell and Voldemort's dominion spread across the wizarding world, Hogwarts did not burn. It did not crumble. It did not even shut its gates. That was the brilliance of the Dark Lord's strategy. He didn't need to destroy the school. He needed it alive, breathing, twisted. He needed it to produce the next generation of cruelty. And so, beneath the ancient stone walls where generations of witches and wizards had once discovered wonder, laughter, and loyalty, Voldemort sowed the seeds of something else entirely: indoctrination, hatred, pain. The vehicle for that transformation came in the form of two siblings, Alecto and Amicus Carrow. They were no ordinary Death Eaters, not mindless brutes like Fenrir Greyback, not cold tacticians like Lucius Malfoy. The Carrows were true believers. They were cruel for the sake of cruelty, cunning in their hatred, and, perhaps worst of all, authorized. When Severus Snape, now headmaster, opened the gates for the 1997-1998 school year, it was these two who walked in behind him, appointed as instructors and enforcers. Amicus took over defense against the dark arts, twisting it into dark arts outright, teaching the casting of Cruciatus. Alecto was given Muggle studies, but what she taught was not understanding. It was revulsion. Amicus, stout and sneering, strutted through the dungeons as though they belonged to him. He taught not just how to cast the Imperious Curse, but encouraged its use on fellow students. The very fabric of Hogwarts, the ideal that knowledge was power used responsibly, was unravelled in each of his classes. "There's nothing wrong with a bit of discipline," he was overheard saying to students who flinched beneath his wand. Detention no longer meant scrubbing cauldrons. It meant blood, bruises, broken minds. Alecto was quieter, but in some ways more insidious. Her lessons painted Muggles not as a different branch of humanity, but as vermin. She whispered that they were barely above animals, that their destruction was both righteous and necessary. Students were forced to write essays outlining the inferiority of Muggles and perform spells that mocked or harmed representations of them. "They're like cockroaches underfoot," she once said in front of the entire Ravenclaw class, with a sneer that chilled even the more ambivalent pureblood students. Neville Longbottom, once clumsy and shy, became one of the few remaining flames of resistance in the darkness. With Harry gone, Hermione in hiding, and Ron on the run, Neville stayed and paid for it. Amycus repeatedly used him as an example, beating him, hexing him, and humiliating him in front of others. But each punishment only hardened Neville. He began leading others in secret rebellions, carving the word Dumbledore's army into the walls of the Room of Requirement. The room itself became more than a secret base. It became a sanctuary, a place of whispered plans and hidden food, of healing spells cast by trembling hands. Underneath the floorboards of this ancient castle, students created a new Hogwarts, one the Carrows couldn't touch. Seamus Finnegan, Lavender Brown, Michael Corner, all found purpose in this underground life. It was a rebellion built not on violence but on endurance, on memory, on the hope that someday the true Hogwarts would return. Yet even hope had a price. When students were caught, the punishments were biblical in scale. Luna Lovegood was taken, Ginny Weasley too. Electos saw them not as children, but as disease carriers. Filth begets filth, she told Snape, who said nothing in reply. His silence became his shield, and to many his guilt. But no one ever saw Snape join the beatings. No one ever saw him raise his wand in punishment. Whether that was an act of mercy or manipulation remains debated. The Carrows ruled with a psychological violence more profound than curses. They turned student against student. Slytherins were encouraged to report their peers. Children whispered to Amycus in exchange for praise or protection. Friendships broke, trust dissolved. Even the sorting hat, silent as ever, seemed to weep from the dust of the staff room. "I always knew you lot were traitors," spat one fourth year to her own cousin in the Great Hall, emboldened by the new regime. Paranoia became the lingua franca of Hogwarts. But not all Slytherins were collaborators. Daphne Greengrass quietly healed first year's hurt in Amycus's class. Theodore Nott slipped information to the DA through enchanted coins Hermione had left behind. The darkness did not claim every soul, and that perhaps was Voldemort's greatest failure. He underestimated the resilience of those born under his boot. Hannah Abbott once fainted at the thought of exams. Now she was sneaking food from the kitchens and smuggling it into the Room of Requirement. Ernie Macmillan wrote essays mocking Electo's theories and charmed them to self-destruct before submission, so no one else would be endangered. The Carrows noticed the resistance, of course, but they couldn't catch it. Hogwarts had become a living paradox, a school enslaved, yet still quietly, defiantly alive. In Harry Potter and the Deathly Hallows, Chapter 29, Professor McGonagall's voice breaks with emotion as she finally expels Amycus. "I wonder," she said in a cold fury, "whether you know how much filth you have brought into this school?" The irony, of course, was that the filth was not physical. It was moral. It was the corruption of childhood, of memory, of the very stones of Hogwarts. No one ever forgot the moment Alecto tried to summon Voldemort from the Ravenclaw Tower. It was Luna and Ginny who had been hiding near the entrance, and when Alecto realized they were there, she spat on the floor and snarled that their kind, blood traitors, would die screaming. It was not just a threat, it was a declaration. Hogwarts was no longer a school, it was a battlefield, every corridor a front line, every book a shield or a weapon. Filch, the long-suffering caretaker, became the willing servant of the Carrows. He prowled the halls with glee, finally allowed to impose the cruelty he'd long dreamt of. He chained students to walls, laughed during punishments. If there was any joy in those dark days, it came not from victory, but from the fact that some, like Neville, never stopped resisting. The Carrows taught more than pain, they taught indifference. Students began stepping over injured peers. They looked away during punishments. They accepted violence as curriculum. That was Voldemort's true goal, to rot the soul of Hogwarts from within, to make children into monsters, or worse, bystanders. Yet for every scream behind a closed door, there was a whispered oath in the Room of Requirement. For every betrayal, there was a hidden act of bravery. Even Peeves, the chaotic poltergeist, joined the side of resistance, dropping chalk and curses on the Carrows when they passed beneath enchanted chandeliers. The ghosts of Hogwarts, usually detached, floated silently in grief through the halls, unable to intervene but never disappearing. The portraits on the walls bore witness to it all. Dumbledore's painting remained silent, refusing to speak to anyone. Perhaps he mourned, perhaps he waited, perhaps he watched the children rise and fall, knowing the storm had not yet passed. The fat lady refused entry to some students who had betrayed their housemates. Even art, once passive, began choosing sides. It was a time when dreams turned to nightmares. Younger students wept in their beds. Older ones took turns guarding corridors at night. Homework became irrelevant. Marks didn't matter. The only grades left were measured in scars, both visible and invisible. The fall of the ministry was not just a political shift. It was a spiritual one. With Umbridge, Hogwarts was poisoned. With the Carrows, it was infected. And yet, despite everything, Harry would return, and so would the light. But this chapter of Hogwarts's history would never fade from its stones. The ghosts of those lessons would linger in its shadows. The Carrows were eventually bound and thrown aside like the vermin they had taught others to hate. But their legacy remained. For years after, students who had lived through that year would twitch at raised voices, flinch at authority, and wake in the night with the memory of curses echoing through stone walls. Not every wound left a mark on the skin, and not every Death Eater needed a skull on their forearm. Some wore their darkness like a cloak of authority, stitched with the fear of children and the silence of compliance. For that 1 year, Death Eaters didn't just walk among the teachers, they were the teachers, and they almost won. Number 26, Grindelwald and the Lie about the Elder Wand. When Lord Voldemort entered the cold, desolate walls of Nurmengard, he did not expect to find a man so calm, so perfectly detached from fear, that he would dare lie to the most feared wizard of the age. Yet Gellert Grindelwald, once the master of the Elder Wand and dark sorcerer of a former era, sat within his prison, worn by time but untouched by shame. Voldemort had come for answers, the wand that defied him, and he was certain he would extract the truth. But what he received was not information, it was misdirection. Grindelwald lied. There was no reason for Grindelwald to lie. Voldemort had no allegiance to him, no mercy to offer. Grindelwald had nothing to gain, no freedom, no revenge, not even the pleasure of survival. And yet he looked Voldemort in the eyes and said that the Elder Wand was not in his possession, nor did he know its location. "Kill me then," he said. "You will not win. You cannot win. That wand will never, ever be yours." His words were steeped in defiance. But what lay beneath them was more than pride. It was a masterstroke of manipulation, one final move on the board of magical power, made by a man whose era was over, yet whose cunning endured. Grindelwald's lie was deliberate. It was not born from fear, for he must have known death would follow, but from a calculation. Grindelwald understood Voldemort better than most. He recognized the obsession, the desperation, the fragile ego cloaked in invincibility, and he played to it. A truth given freely would have empowered Voldemort, would have confirmed his suspicions and propelled him further down the right path. But a lie laced with scorn, would provoke, it would enrage, and in that rage Voldemort might falter. What made Grindelwald's deception so potent was that it came from someone who had once possessed the very wand Voldemort sought. The Elder Wand had been Grindelwald's most prized artifact, stolen from the grave of Mikhail Grigorovich. Grindelwald had wielded it with skill and terror, spreading his doctrine of magical superiority across Europe. For decades, the wand had served him, until Albus Dumbledore, his former friend and greatest rival, defeated him in 1945 and claimed it. That fact was known only to a few, but it was the crux of the lie. Voldemort, who disdained love and underestimated loyalty, could never imagine that a man like Grindelwald would lie simply to sabotage another dark wizard's rise. Yet that is exactly what he did. In this moment, Grindelwald chose Dumbledore, or perhaps he chose something else entirely, not redemption, but resistance. a final defiance, not for the side of good, but against the madness that had consumed Voldemort's crusade. By the time Voldemort discovered the wand's real location, Dumbledore's white marble tomb on the grounds of Hogwarts, he had already been misled. Grindelwald's deception had cost Voldemort time and clarity. The lie poisoned his certainty. Even when Voldemort opened the tomb and took the wand from Dumbledore's resting hands, the wand did not serve him truly, because mastery, as Dumbledore once said, is not gained through theft or bloodshed, but through a deeper magic, allegiance. The irony was perfect. Voldemort, who believed he could subjugate death itself, was now chasing a wand that refused to obey him. And Grindelwald, who had long lost his kingdom, planted the seed of that rebellion. His lie echoed through the shadows of every spell Voldemort failed to perfect. Every time the Elder Wand resisted, it was as if Grindelwald whispered, "You will not win." Grindelwald's manipulation was not just tactical, it was poetic. He had lived long enough to understand that power, unrestrained, is often the tool of its own undoing. By denying Voldemort the truth, Grindelwald didn't just prolong the war, he corrupted its logic. He left Voldemort doubting. And when doubt touches a tyrant, even briefly, it alters the trajectory of destiny. In this case, it fractured Voldemort's confidence in his weapon, and by extension, in himself. In truth, Grindelwald's decision to lie was the closest he ever came to remorse. Not the tearful, redemptive remorse that absolves, but the cold, calculated kind that sees evil for what it is and chooses to no longer feed it. In that prison cell, Grindelwald did not deny his past while he confronted its mirror. Voldemort was what he might have become had his ideology not collapsed under the weight of Dumbledore's confrontation. In Voldemort's face, he saw a reflection, more brutal, less brilliant, utterly devoid of restraint. And he spat at it. J.K. Rowling's Deathly Hallows paints this encounter with chilling brevity. "He lied, did he?" said Harry after learning of the conversation. "Yes, I think he wanted Voldemort to think the wand was not there," Dumbledore later confirmed. This lie, wrapped in hatred and twisted loyalty, was Grindelwald's last rebellion, not for justice, but against chaos. And perhaps for once, his lie did more good than his truth ever did. What makes Grindelwald's manipulation so fascinating is its subtlety. He didn't scream, didn't curse, didn't resist, physically. He offered Voldemort exactly what Voldemort couldn't handle: a denial, a challenge to his dominion. For a man like Voldemort, whose self-image was tied to omniscience and control, this denial was unbearable. Grindelwald struck not with a wand, but with words, and in doing so, he left a scar that Voldemort couldn't erase. Even the nature of the Elder Wand itself plays into Grindelwald's scheme. The wand is not simply a tool. It is a sentient relic responding to mastery, not possession. Grindelwald knew this. He understood the wand's fickle loyalty, its ancient rules. Voldemort, in his arrogance, believed possession was enough. He thought power came from taking. Grindelwald's lie exploited that misunderstanding perfectly. The repercussions of that lie were immense. Voldemort murdered Snape, thinking Snape was the wand's master. That act, unnecessary, brutal, was born from Grindelwald's misdirection. It marked another rift in Voldemort's crumbling empire. Every move became a reaction, not a plan, and Grindelwald, locked in a cell, had orchestrated it with a single sentence. It is tempting to see Grindelwald's action as heroic, but heroism is too generous a word. He was not seeking to save lives. He did not care for the Order of the Phoenix, nor did he align himself with Harry's cause. His motives remain shrouded, perhaps in pride, perhaps in strategy, or perhaps in the cold satisfaction of outwitting the man who dared usurp his legacy. Grindelwald did not want Voldemort to wield his wand. That may have been reason enough. This rivalry between two dark legends of their respective eras never played out in battle. But in that moment, in Nurmengard, Grindelwald delivered his blow. A quiet, deadly strike made not with spellwork, but with silence and contempt. Voldemort never suspected he had been outplayed. That, perhaps, was the deepest wound. In the end, Grindelwald died at Voldemort's hand. His prison was silenced, but his influence remained. The path Voldemort took was shaped, in part, by that encounter, by the deception of a man long thought defeated, and so Grindelwald's lie lived longer than Grindelwald himself. It stretched its shadow into the final hours of the Second Wizarding War. What is perhaps most haunting is that Grindelwald died with a smile, not of peace, but of victory. He had known Voldemort would fail, because power, when taken without understanding, always collapses. He had once believed differently. He had built an empire on the dream of magical dominion. But time had taught him. Dumbledore had taught him. And so, in that moment, Grindelwald chose to disrupt, to mislead, to twist the story away from Voldemort's hands. The lie about the Elder Wand was not a redemption, it was a stratagem. Grindelwald's final move was not made to save, but to sabotage, and it worked. For Voldemort, the wand was never truly his. The magic never flowed as it should. His final curse, cast with the Elder Wand, rebounded and killed him. The wand rejected him, as Grindelwald had known it would. Thus the tale of the Elder Wand ends not with its wielder, but with its deceiver. Grindelwald, the fallen prince of dark magic, made his last mark not with flame or fury, but with a whisper that sent Voldemort stumbling down a false road. He lied, and the world changed. Number 27, The Death of Hedwig, a strike at the symbol. It happened fast, too fast to make sense of it. In the chaos of the skies, with spells exploding like fireworks and shadows flitting across the clouds, Hedwig's cry pierced the night. One moment she soared, loyal and silent in her cage, and the next, gone. A flash of green, and the most faithful companion Harry had ever known fell lifeless. It was the opening shot in the Battle of the Seven Potters, a night drenched in terror and fire. Yet of all the losses that night, Hedwig's was the most piercing, for she was not just an owl, she was Harry's tether to innocence, to freedom, to the life that had once seemed, despite its darkness, somehow pure. Her death marked the end of that illusion. From the moment Harry met her in Harry Potter and the Philosopher's Stone, Hedwig was more than a pet. She was his first true friend, a gift from Hagrid on the threshold of a new life. Who'd want to celebrate being stuck with the Dursleys? Harry once wondered. But Hedwig changed that. Her snow-white feathers and quiet dignity brought magic to the mundane. She flew freely while Harry remained locked in a cupboard. She delivered letters across impossible distances when no one else cared to speak to him. She was a beacon of connection in a world that often left Harry feeling utterly alone, and Voldemort knew that. For all his cold calculation, the Dark Lord understood one thing with terrible clarity. Symbols matter. He had once used the symbol of fear itself, the Dark Mark, to control hearts and minds. He knew that Harry's strength came not from spells or wands, but from the people and creatures he loved. That night, he did not aim to kill just the boy. He aimed to crush the boy's world. In killing Hedwig, Voldemort shattered more than feathers and bone. He struck at the emotional architecture that kept Harry human. It is easy to dismiss Hedwig as just an owl. But in the wizarding world, where pets are often magical extensions of their owners, she was a spiritual companion. Crookshanks was more than Hermione's cat. Scabbers turned out to be a traitor in disguise. But Hedwig, she was loyal to the end. Her silence was never empty. It was full of understanding. When Harry was alone, she was his echo. When he was afraid, she brought stillness. Her presence meant the world still held something untouched by pain. When she died, Rowling didn't give us a lengthy farewell. It happened quickly. A flash of green light, a burst of fire, and Hedwig fell to the floor of her cage. That was it. No time to grieve. No time to say goodbye, but perhaps that's what made it more devastating. There was no warning, no comfort, just the brutal finality of loss. In a moment meant to be exhilarating, a high-speed chase in the sky, came a death that felt intimate and cold. It was a reminder. No one, not even the innocent, is safe now. Her death also marked a turning point in tone. The early books, despite their dangers, had a charm, a rhythm of safety. Children might have been threatened, but there was always the sense that things would work out. With Hedwig's death, that changed. This wasn't an adventure anymore. It was war. There were no safe places, no protected characters. Her lifeless body falling within the first few pages of Harry Potter and the Deathly Hallows signaled to readers, this will hurt. And it did. It hurt Harry too in ways he couldn't express. After all, he'd lost before, his parents, Sirius, even Dumbledore. But Hedwig's death was different. She was a piece of his boyhood. She had been with him before the fame, before the battles. She had slept in his cupboard, perched in his room, flown over Hogwarts. Her death was like the closing of a door that would never open again. For Harry, it was the end of the last remnant of peace he ever knew. The symbolism of her whiteness cannot be ignored. In literature, white often represents purity, hope, or transcendence. Hedwig was all of these. She was the only white creature Harry owned in a life surrounded by darkness. Her feathers gleamed even in the shadowy corners of the Dursleys' house. In a sense, she was the light he carried with him. And just as Voldemort shunned light, he destroyed it. Not because she was dangerous, but because she meant something. What makes this loss even more chilling is its intentionality. The books never confirm if Voldemort deliberately aimed at Hedwig, but the effect is too perfect to be an accident. Voldemort had many ways to strike at Harry, but this one was subtle, even elegant. It was not a blow to the body, but a slice across the soul. He didn't just want to kill Harry, he wanted to unmake him, to peel away every layer of love and loyalty until Harry was a shell. Killing Hedwig wasn't strategy, it was psychological warfare. For the reader, too, the moment was a rupture. In earlier books, magical creatures often had agency, meaning, and longevity. Fawkes could rise from ashes, Buckbeak escaped execution, even Nagini, evil as she was, had a complex arc. But Hedwig, she was never complicated. She was simply good. To see goodness destroyed so carelessly was horrifying. Rowling used that moment to prepare readers for what was to come. From that point onward, anyone could die. The cage in which Hedwig died is itself a symbol. She had spent much of her life confined, just as Harry had, but she was never broken by it. Her strength was in her ability to fly, to return, to endure. That she died inside a cage speaks volumes. In that instant, freedom itself was extinguished. The message was brutal and unambiguous. This world is no longer safe for the free. Hedwig's absence left an echo in the rest of the book. When Harry is forced to flee, hide, or battle, the lack of her presence is palpable. No more silent companionship during night watches, no more comfort in her weight on his arm. The skies are lonelier now, his letters go unsent, his grief goes unspoken, and the world continues to spiral into shadows. This loss also marked the beginning of a pattern. Dobby, Fred, Lupin, Tonks, all would follow. But Hedwig was first. She was the threshold sacrifice, and unlike others, she didn't die in battle, she didn't die to save someone, she was just there, doing what she always did, and she was killed for it. Her death reminded us that evil doesn't need a reason. Sometimes it kills just because it can. It's worth remembering how Harry reacted. He didn't scream, he didn't weep, he fought. But inside, something shifted. From that moment, his mission was no longer abstract. He wasn't just destroying Horcruxes, he was fighting for the memory of those who gave him meaning. Each loss added weight to his choices, but Hedwig's loss was the one he carried in silence. In the broader scope of the series, Hedwig's death ties back to one of Rowling's central themes, that love and loss are intertwined. The things we love define us, and their loss shapes us even more. Harry loved Hedwig, not in the dramatic, explosive way he loved Sirius or Dumbledore, but in the quiet, enduring way that truly matters. In losing her, he lost the last vestige of the boy he once was. For all his fame, Harry was never truly understood by the world, but Hedwig understood him. She didn't need explanations or apologies. She didn't ask for anything but care. She accepted him fully. And in return, Harry found in her a kind of grounding no other character provided. Her death, then, was not just the end of a life, but the severing of a connection that had kept him anchored. Even years later, fans still speak of Hedwig's death with reverence. She was, after all, the first to die in the final book, a book about war, sacrifice, and growing up. Her death set the tone. It reminded us that the magical world could be cruel, that even beauty is not immune, that sometimes the ones we least expect to die are the ones whose loss leaves the deepest scar. Voldemort might have seen her as insignificant, but her death was not. It was a message, a declaration of emotional dominance. And in that moment, he succeeded. He made Harry bleed without drawing blood. He took something irreplaceable, something that no wand could bring back. The legacy of Hedwig lives not in her feathers, but in the silence that followed, in the quiet moments when Harry stared at the sky, or when the wind passed without wings. She became the ghost that never haunted, but always remained. A memory of what was and what could never be again. In the end, the war was not just waged in spells and duels, it was fought in hearts. Voldemort attacked symbols because he feared them. He feared the strength they gave to others, and Hedwig, pure, loyal, and free, was a symbol Harry never truly let go of. Her death was a wound, but it also lit a fire, because from that moment on, Harry wasn't just surviving, he was remembering, fighting, avenging. And beneath it all, somewhere in the shadows of his mind, Hedwig still flew.